of these are almost lifelike, and just how precision he does his job with these is amazing.
Talk a little bit about Scott Dixon. Scott Dixon is the man this year, and he's the silent warrior, if you will. He's the ninja, if you will. Scott Dixon is the Iceman for a reason. And I tell you what, he breaks the matrix. He finished 5th at Road America. I tell you what, Scott Dixon is always going to be behind. Anytime you look in your rearview mirror, you're going to see Scott Dixon there. He's coming for you. He's coming for the win. Scott Dixon's the real deal in 2019.
Yeah, but I think he's got a lot to do if he's going to take the title away from Rossi and Newgard. He's consistently been behind them in most of the events so far this season. Has lost points. Unless he turns it around and makes a big charge, which he's capable of doing, you're right. But I just don't see the scenario where he wins title number 6 in 2019. I think right now the better bets are for Rossi and Newgard unless something drastic happens to one of them.
Chip Ganassi Racing seems to has it figured out between their two drivers. What are your thoughts? Chip Ganassi, I think, is got a strategy going in 2019. Maybe it doesn't pay off the way they want to in 2019, but hey, they've been up in the top of every race. Either one of their two of their drivers have been every race. Chip Ganassi Racing 2019. I think the old Chipper might be back.
I wouldn't necessarily say that yet because I think right now Rosenquist is still has some refining to do, and the consistency isn't quite there for him to, be a title threat. I mean, he still hasn't won his first race yet. So, I mean, he got to such a great start at St. Pete, but he's kind of, flatlined since that result. So he needs to get back in the groove, and like I said, it's going to take a big run from Dixon to get there. And again, let's face it, we looked at the last couple of years of the Indianapolis 500, and they have not been a factor since Scott Dixon won the pole in 2017. They were disappointing in 2018, and they were disappointing in this year. So there's still, I think, a lot of loose ends in the Ganassi camp that need to be refined. But again, having some consistency among teammates, I think, would help them. I mean, Dixon's had a new teammate each of the last 3 years, and I don't think that helps with continuity and the transfer information. And when you got to do it on your own, that doesn't necessarily help things. That's why the multi-car team aspect is so popular, because you could transfer information and then regain from that. And when it's tough to, transfer information when you have a different driver with a different driving style every year as your teammate. I don't think that really helps. I mean, it's not necessarily a detriment, but it certainly is not a positive as far as challenging for a championship in the case of Scott Dixon.
Roger Penske, one of the most dominant racing organizations in the world. Obviously, congratulations to Roger Penske for winning the Medal of Freedom given to him by Donald Trump. But for all of his acclimates and achievements that he's done, Simon Pageon made a trip to the White House. It was really cool to see that happen. But Penske, let's talk about them as a whole, as a team. They obviously have some of the biggest names in racing: Will Power, Joseph Newgard, and Simon Pageon. Roger Penske, one of the most dominant racing forces in the world across the board. Roger Penske, 2019. What are we looking at right now where he's at as far as a team-wise goes?
Well, you've got two strong cogs, and I'd still say a iffy cog, because Pagenaud struggled again at Road America this past weekend. Yes, he made a decent comeback in the race, but you can't expect to gain decent points when you're starting at the mid or back of the pack every race, and that seems like where Pagenaud's been, with the exception of the Indy 500. Now, that his focus, that Pagenaud was more focused on Indy because that was one of his main targets to hit. Who knows? But in the end, Pagenaud's been the weak cog of the group. Power, amazingly, still has not won a race in 2019. That's hard to believe. And Joseph Newgard, I think, is their title threat. Not to say Power could join the party late, but hard to believe that we are now 10 races into 2019, and Will Power, a driver of his ability and Team Penske's ability, that he is winless at this point in the season.
Talking with Matthew Embury, WSBT up in South Bend. I appreciate you taking some time from your duties there at the U.S. Senior Open and walking around the golf course. What a great day to be on the golf course. I wish I was on the golf course today. But, you know, one of the things that we look at the road courses, especially, well, that's when it is really used, but is the push to pass. How can IndyCar improve this push to pass? Because there's a lot of strategy behind using those, and there's only so many that you can use. But IndyCar needs to improve the ruling of the push to pass. First of all, a lot of people don't know what that is. Maybe explain what that is to our novice listeners.
That gives an extra boost, makes it easier to overtake. As far as fixing it, about the only way to do it would probably be to employ the FIA DRS, but obviously that would be way too much extra money that the teams have to spend, and I don't think you necessarily want to do that. I think you've got a decent system in there. It's just the problem is when you have cars that are this equal or this close in time, that makes them at same speed, so it makes it tougher to overtake. So I think it's more on the fact that the field is so close that it makes it tough to overtake as opposed to there being an issue with the tracks of the car itself.
Well, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit. Let's move on into Toronto. Obviously, the streets of Toronto, hopefully they've calmed down enough now after winning the NBA championship. But next weekend, next weekend, or is it the weekend after? I don't have my dates up here, but they'll be rolling into the streets of Toronto. Obviously, that's the home track, home area, if you will, of James Hinchcliffe. I always like watching these street courses, and I know I'm an Oval fan because based here in Indianapolis, but I really do like watching these street courses. You talk about Long Beach and you talk about St. Pete and Toronto. These street courses are pretty awesome. Let's talk about Toronto. That's what's up next.
Well, maybe not so much St. Pete, but certainly Long Beach and Toronto, which have been mainstays in open-wheel racing for many, many years. I think those there's a tradition factor with those. Unfortunately, when you think Toronto, though, you also think of the tragic accident of Jeff Krosnoff in 1996 that also claimed the corner worker Gary Irvin. So it's not been, peaches and cream completely at Toronto, but certainly it's a competitive circuit. I think normally the driver with the most skill is the one that is successful at that event more often than not.
Let's talk about Canada, IndyCar, the broadcasts, and we've talked about this with Tyson. I think Tyson's going to join us next week to talk about Toronto, but the Canadians don't have the flexibility and the ability to watch IndyCar like we do. It seems like this could be a very simple fix, but it's not.
Well, I think they should be complaining more at CBC, TSN, Sportnet for not picking up IndyCar. It's not IndyCar's fault that those three Canadian channels, which are the big three channels as far as sports coverage, are not interested in covering IndyCar right now. That's right now the concern. I think it's far-fetched for Canadian fans to take the blame solely at NBC, because NBC is not doing any exclusivity things. It's just the fact that CBC, Sportnet, Canada, and TSN just don't want to cover IndyCar racing for some reason.
Well, let's just point out that if you have the ability to have a streaming device, that's an international thing, as long as you're able to get the streaming. So I would think that if you need to download the NBC Sports apps, well, there you go. You've got it there. Let's go back to Road America a little bit. Matthew, with all the emphasis on driver safety over the last 3 years, why was a yellow flag not thrown at Road America with the large pieces of asphalt? Remember that? And even the broadcasters were talking about this is something's going on here. If one of those had been hit by a car or thrown into the helmet, I mean, that could have been disastrous, if not fatal. Why was there not a yellow flag thrown? Because it wasn't a little chunk of asphalt. It was almost like a pothole.
The problem is when they noticed it was right in the middle of pit stops. Had they thrown the yellow flag, a few drivers who pitted early would have been absolutely had their races ruined. So I think IndyCar realized that, and they would have gotten the complaints afterwards. But my biggest concern with that is, the track coming apart. I mean, Road America, unfortunately, has a history of being one of the roughest circuits there. And the last thing you need at one of these high-speed corners like the Kink, et cetera, is for there to be something that breaks an axle on one of these cars and sends a car into the wall and possibly into a tumble. So my concern was on that right now with the cars losing control, hitting that at a high speed and possibly suffering a horrendous crash, like, for instance, the crash we saw at Captain Leg a few years ago where the car literally came apart, and thankfully she walked away from it. But that's the kind of accidents that you don't want to see, especially with the cars going as fast as they are at some of these parts of the course.
Let's talk a little bit about where we are with the standings as we watch the points keep racking up, if you will, as we move through the 2019 season. Let's kind of look underneath the microscope of the top 10 drivers in the standings. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the thing right now is they're going to be a third wheel in the mix right now, because I think it's clear that Rossi and Newgarden have separated themselves from the rest of the contenders for the championship at this point. The question is, can someone like, say, a Scott Dixon or Will Power get on a roll and get themselves back into contention? Because I think that's what it's going to take for, a third party to get involved in this. Because right now, Newgarden and Rossi have been the two biggest cogs so far and the most consistent ones. And I think if that continues, one of those two will be lifting the Astor Cup after Laguna Seca. I just don't see a scenario unless someone gets on a big run where a third party gets involved.
So we got Joseph Newgarden, Alexander Rossi, Simon Pageon, Scott Dixon, and Will Power. Any surprises within that group?
Obviously, Pagenaud, I think it's a surprise. Of course, he won the Indy 500 worth double points, but I expect him, unless he can regain that form through the rest of the season, not just Indy, I think you'll see him drop out of the mix. And then the question is, well, can Dixon or Power get on a run? I think that's what it's going to take for one of them to take the title away from Rossi or Newgarden. Because right now, I think those two are just head and shoulders above the rest of the pack right now. And until that changes, the best bets for the title, like I've said, are between Alexander Rossi and Joseph Newgarden, with as many races that are left on the schedule at this point.
No, you're absolutely right. I know you got a lot going on there at the U.S. Senior Open there. So I was just kind of zipping through this here real quickly here. Look at Ryan Hunter-Reay, Graham Rahal, and James Hinchcliffe. Where are we at with that?
Rahal's just been, in the lull, and I think you can say the same thing about Hunter-Reay and about Hinchcliffe. I think Hunter-Reay's best chance for glory was at Indy when he didn't qualify well, got the back qualifying draw that ended his chances, and the same goes for Hinchcliffe. I don't know if he's more conservative now after the bad accidents he's suffered or what the case is, or, he's kind of shell-shocked from the kind of rude awakening he's had the last 2 years at Indy. I don't know what the case is, but he seems to be rattled, and you just can't predict Graham Rahal. He is the most unpredictable driver on the IndyCar circuit. At times he looks like a world beater. At times he looks like, a field filler. And until he gains that consistency, which I don't know in this part of his career he's going to be able to do, but until he does that, I just don't see a scenario where Graham Rahal is going to be a championship contender on the IndyCar circuit in the foreseeable future.
James Hinchcliffe obviously going home to Toronto next week. What are your thoughts about him?
He's actually been snake bit, I think, at Toronto based on, if my memory serves me, I don't have the records in front of me, but actually it seems like there's added pressure at some of these home events, and it just depends on how you handle it. I mean, yes, Ed Carpenter qualifies well at Indy, but he doesn't finish well, and Hinchcliffe has not been on either side of the coin positively at Toronto as far as I can tell in his first few appearances. So it's been more of a kryptonite track for him as opposed to a health track in terms of Toronto and the relationship between it and James Hinchcliffe.
We've been talking with Matthew Embury, WSBT in South Bend, joining us for our official IndyCar contributor, joining us for some IndyCar talk. I know you're also splitting duty up there at the U.S. Senior Open in South Bend, but where can people find you working your masterpieces, sir?
MATTEMBURY on Twitter. And I should also mention big event on IMSA's schedule tomorrow with the Sailor